Very, very privileged because you're going to see some home movies that were provided to us by Barbara Jacques, who's the grandniece of Missy Lehand. And you're going to see some home movies that no one's ever seen before. So they have really created. Do we have any membership with us tonight? If you're a member, raise your hand. I want to thank you for your support. We have some interesting membership programs coming up soon. If you want to become a member, we have a table set up in the back. Do we have a trustee here tonight? Is Shirley Knight? Who do we have in the back? It's Steve Lemezo, Dr. Lemezo. Thank you for. Who is that? Fritzy. Fritzy. I can't see you, Fritzy. Hey, Dom. There she is. Fritzy, good. Thank you. Steve Lemezo, Dr. Lemezo, there he is over there. Those are our trustees. They've tremendous support for the library over the years. And without that support, we wouldn't be able to do programs like this or have authors like this come in. So, first of all, first question. Why did you choose Missy Lehand?
Because I wanted her job. Whenever I read about it,
Louder.
Is her mic on?
No.
Her lovely scarf blocking us there.
No.
my mind wasn't on.
How's that?
I just thought it was my soft southern voice. I told the audience in New York this week that I was at a disadvantage because English is my second language. I'm a southerner. But I would read books about FDR, and I've been reading them since I was a fairly young person, and there was always this woman just hovering right at his shoulder, Marguerite Lehand, and the more I read about her just on the periphery, I thought, wow, what a fabulous job that must have been. And I wanted to read her biography, and I contacted the library here about 3 years ago. Bob Clark was the supervising archivist then, and I asked him if he could recommend a biography of Missy Lehand, and he said to his knowledge there has never been one written, not even a dissertation. So I thought, well, I'll write my own, and that's what I set out to do.
So we're going to look at the first of the video clips now, and this is really fascinating. This was shot here at HYDE Park. It's shot in the study over at the home, Springwood, and it shows FDR and Missy and Dr. McIntyre, and I think it was shot in 1933. Cliff, can we go ahead and roll that first clip? What I love is how formal they're. Now, of course. Now, Sarah Roosevelt, of course, loved the fact that her home, Springwood, was the HYDE Park White House. And when they built the library and FDR moved to study over there, she had a big portrait painted so she could look over his shoulder. Here he is, you can see him now with his stamp collection. And Missy would spend a lot of time with him, helping him with his stamps. So how did FDR first meet Missy? How did they connect in the first place?
She came to work for his campaign for vice president in 1920 as the staff secretary. And he was on the campaign trail really through that whole election. He was stopped all across the country, gave 1,000 speeches. But afterwards, the story goes that Eleanor Roosevelt invited her to come to HYDE Park after he and his running mate were defeated badly by Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge. She invited Missy to come to HYDE Park and help clean up the correspondence. And they got along so well that FDR, who was planning to go into the private sector and work on Wall Street, asked her to come and work for him. She had to think about it because she told him that she found legal work really boring and she wasn't sure she wanted to work for a lawyer. And he said, oh, don't worry, there'll be a lot of other things we'll do. So she came in January 1921.
And of course, 1921 was a big year in the life of Franklin Roosevelt.
Yeah.
He contracted polio that summer. And so the nature of their relationship went through a fairly dramatic transformation. You want to talk about what happened to them when he got polio?
He got polio in August of 1921, and in fact, Missy had just written a letter to him asking for a raise. And the reply came from Eleanor Roosevelt, who said her husband had been in bed with a deep chill, and she felt that if Missy could wait until he got back to New York and made her case, she could probably get a raise. And Missy was just mortified that he'd been sick, but she didn't know how sick then. But he spent a long period after that trying to get rehabilitated. He always wanted to be able to walk again. There was a lot of infighting in the family. His children were at difficult ages. His mother was tucking in one way, his wife another. Louis Howe, his political advisor, was on the scene. And finally, in the winter of 1923, he just had it. So he rented a houseboat with a friend, and he went down to the Florida Keys with Missy and a friend, and people would come and visit. They had a crew on the boat, and they just spent the winter going around the Keys, fishing and swimming and drinking and partying and having a good old time. Eleanor never came. She didn't enjoy those pursuits, and plus she had 5 children she was looking after. So Missy became his hostess on board, and FDR was also carrying on a very large correspondence all over the country to Democrats trying to rebuild the party after the disastrous election loss. So she was being secretary too. The next year he bought a boat. Is it LaRocco or LaRocco? LaRocco or LaRocco? There's always a dispute.
It rhymes with Coco.
Coco. Okay, so LaRocco, maybe. Then he bought this boat with the same friend, and the friend said that it looked like looked like a floating tenement, which if you've ever seen pictures, it really did. And Missy, again, was the hostess on that during the winter months. Eleanor came down for one period of time and did not like it. She didn't like being out in the water, and she was just happy to leave her husband in Missy's capable hands.
Now, this was the period that started the rumors that there was a romantic relationship between the two of them. How would you like to address that?
Well, the main perpetrator of that story is the Roosevelt son, Elliot, who was, I think, 12 or 13 at that time. And he said that he had seen Missy sitting on his father's lap in her nightgown. Well, this was a very small boat, and FDR wrote these funny poems about community life and how everybody is in their pajamas and nightgowns and there are no secrets held from anyone else. But we don't know. Could have been. But there are a good many reasons to think that she was not his lover. She was a single woman. She was Roman Catholic. Birth control was real unreliable then. She had a heart condition that dated to childhood that would have made her life at stake for pregnancy. Plus, she really was very close to Eleanor Roosevelt, but we really don't know.
So we're going to look at our second clip now. So around the same period, FDR discovered Warm Springs, Georgia, and the recursive powers of the hot springs they had here. And they did all sorts of fun things there. Clip, we go ahead and roll the second clip, and you'll see that the sort of activities they engaged in. What I love about this is that people are just having fun. So they had picnics. What was the name of the little knoll?
That was not.
That was not, right.
There's Missy. She wore sunglasses outside.
And FDR really loved this area. It's a very rural part of Georgia.
Now that's James Farley.
That's his son.
And St. James.
James there. That's very rare footage of him in a wheelchair. Here's Missy in a bathing suit with Grace.
Grace Holly and Paula Larrabee, who were sisters and very close friends. They all worked together. And this is so cute. I wish they had sound because I'd love to hear them. A picnic at the pool.
And you can see his legs, how atrophied they are.
And Missy's wearing her dark glasses, and they've got those little bottles with Coca-Cola the way God intended you to drink.
And of course, what's really interesting about it is that because he was surrounded by other polio sufferers, he was very comfortable in allowing them to see his disability, which of course was a closely guarded secret outside of the family. Eleanor didn't spend a lot of time in Warm Springs. Why is that?
No. When FDR came to Warm Springs for the first time in October 1924, he had with him Eleanor, Missy, and his valet, a young man named Roy Jones, who was one of a series of young men that him move about. Eleanor only stayed for a few days. She did not like Georgia, did not like the poverty, the racism. And I think she was perfectly horrified when she went to get some chicken for supper and found out she had to buy it on the hoof. As FDR said, and then the cook killed the chicken in the yard. That was just a little bit too close from the barn to the dinner table. So again, she left her husband in the care of Missy. And eventually, that just became, she said in a letter to her daughter once that she just didn't like to go to Warm Springs for different reasons, and besides, that's pause time with Missy. And Missy really loved it there. One thing that I think is important and made this emphasis in my book is that she was integral to establishing that rehab center at Warm Springs. There was nothing of the kind in the country. And for a long time, they had no medical staff. So it was old Dr. Roosevelt and Nurse Lehand. Neither of them had any medical training, but they worked with the patients in the warm water pools and then just created an atmosphere of fun and hope that made people feel better and feel that they didn't have to go back home and live in a back room in their family's house and be ashamed of their infirmity.
FDR invested almost half of his fortune in rehabilitating Warm Springs and turning it into the premier polio rehabilitation center. But he also formed the Warm Springs Foundation, which eventually became the Warm Springs Infantile Paralysis Foundation. Then it became the March of Dimes. You want to talk about that?
It was actually two separate foundations. His law partner, Basil O'Connor, who FDR kind of strong-armed into running all these things, and then Basil O'Connor came to truly love it, suggested that since he couldn't make a go of this as a for-profit business, that he create a non-profit foundation. And then in 1938, they created a separate organization called the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis. It came to be known as the March of Dimes. And it raised money that helped Warm Springs. There was a rehab for African American patients at Tuskegee, and then it raised all the money that paid for the research that found the cure, the vaccine for polio in the 1950s. So, I'd like to quote my friend Steve LeMazo, one of your trustees, who's a doctor, and says that the March of Dimes is the only charity in history that actually found a cure for the disease it set out to cure and worked itself out of business. It turned itself into the cause became birth defects and healthy babies, which is what the March of Dimes is today. So it's an amazing story, funded totally by the private sector, mostly in small denominations.
And of course, it has a contemporary parallel because he was attacked for taking the money.
Exactly like the Clinton Foundation today. I mean, these same words are used. It's really amazing that people accused him of lining his pockets with the money that was raised and granting political favors to people who supported companies that supported the March of Dimes. And it just incensed FDR because he knew how important this work was. And I just think, what if he had caved in to the critics and said, okay, that's it, no more money raised under my name for the March of Dimes? How many more people would have died of polio or been crippled by polio? So every time you pull a dime out of your pocket or your purse and look at that head of FDR, that's why he's on the dime. That's our constant reminder that he founded the March of Dimes. You didn't know that, did you? A lot of people go, oh, I didn't know it either until quite recently. So that's why he's on the dime.
Well, the other remarkable thing that they did was they decided that they needed to come up with a fundraiser, and so they decided to turn FDR's birthday into a fundraiser for the Polio Foundation, and they called it the Birthday Bash.
Birthday balls.
And birthday balls, and they would have it, there were 6,000 the first year they did it, and they raised $1 million. It was unprecedented. No one had ever done this sort of thing as a fundraiser to cure a disease, so it really was just extraordinary what they did. Okay, so 1928, FDR becomes governor of New York, and Missy moves into a new sort of role in the political sphere again now.
This is when she
became
the gatekeeper.
The gatekeeper. Yeah. I highly recommend.
Everybody needs 2 copies. It's funny. The title of this book was suggested to me by the publisher, and when that came out, I thought, wow, and I was just going to call the book Missy. But it brought me back to when, about 40 years ago, when I was just getting out of college and going into the working world. My father gave me 2 pieces of advice. He said, when you meet someone, shake their hands, man or woman, look them straight in the eye. And he says, make friends with all the secretaries because they're the gatekeepers, and you're not going to get to the person behind the gate if the secretary doesn't like you. He was right, and that's what Missy became. She lived in the governor's mansion. This was the beginning of her time of cohabitating with the Roosevelt family. Eleanor invited her to live in the governor's mansion, and she worked in the governor's mansion also. FDR had an office at the Capitol, I guess, in New York, but she didn't work there, but he did about half his business at home. He'd go up there for a few hours in the morning and do ceremonial stuff, and then he'd come home, and he'd have lots of guests in and company in, and they always had lots of dinners and teas. Well, at this point, Eleanor Roosevelt not only had become a very, very big power in the Democratic Party in New York and nationally, even with women voters, she also owned a school in Manhattan with 2 friends, and she was teaching 3 days a week, and she didn't want to give it up, understandably. So she would get on the train every Sunday night, go to New York, stay there till Wednesday afternoon, take the train back to Albany, and she depended on Missy to be the hostess in her absence. So Missy presided over social events or guests for dinner or ordered the groceries, supervised the staff, and then also handled all of FDR's private correspondence and did all kinds of other things. She later said it was the hardest work she'd ever done because she didn't have any help. And this was after she'd been working in the White House for several years. She said Albany was harder than working in the White House.
Now, this is also when she got the nickname, the right-hand woman.
Yeah, Roosevelt's right-hand woman.
The press dubbed her the right-hand woman. And what's interesting about that period is that it sort of established a trust between them, and also introduced her to a character named Louis Howe.
Yeah.
You want to talk about her?
Yeah.
Louis?
Yeah. Louis Howe was Roosevelt's. He was like Karl Rove to George W. Bush, or James Carville to Bill Clinton, or any other group of any other comparison you'd like to make of an operator in their political figure. Louis Howe was about 5 feet tall, had a face just full of pockmark. He was just hideously ugly. He chain smoked all the time these really smelly cigarettes called Sweet Capitals. All of his clothes were covered with dust. He just had really nasty personal habits, but he was a political genius. And he orchestrated FDR's return to public life. He became very close with Eleanor. And he and Missy had, I think, a lot of friction in their relationship, though she was usually too nice to say much about that. But Louis was very jealous of anyone who got close to FDR, so he would try to maneuver around them, and any number of people, had felt his displeasure. So that was when she met Louis Howe.
Well, when they moved to the White House, Louis tried to get her desk assigned into the other building. But where did she end up?
She wound up right outside the Oval Office, and she stayed there. She was the only staff member that was right outside the Oval Office.
All right, we're going to get ready for this next clip now. One of the things that is a recurring theme with the Roosevelt, particularly FDR, is boats. He loved boats. And this is some footage that we just thought was a lot of fun from 1933 when they were up in Campbell. It's going from the home back out to the destroyer. We can just run this clip. And you'll see FDR getting into it. First of all, I want one of these boats. But when he arrived there was quite the regatta.
Light a cigarette.
There's, gas-powered boats, cigarettes, is a good combination.
Gas-powered boats.
Yeah, there we go. And so there was actually 2 boats. So FDR's in one boat, and then Missy Lehand and Moley, what's Moley's first name? Raymond Moley are in the other boat. You can see they're shooting the FDR boat from this one. That's Missy.
Now, Raymond Moley was FDR. He was the brain trust guy and brilliant economist. This is Grace Tully. We're getting a glamour shot of Grace. She was Missy's assistant.
You can just tell they're having fun. And it must be nice to have your own personal destroyer.
First to be president, I think.
Yeah, he loved that. So yes, they lived quite the seagoing lifestyle. They loved being out on the water. They did all.
Well, it's another time when FDR didn't feel crippled. He could drive a boat, and he loved boating. And Missy loved it also. She loved fishing, and that was another thing that he and Eleanor just did not share that love of the water. So she put up with everything.
Now, when they were in the White House, Missy's from Massachusetts, and there was an aspiring young politician named Tip O'Neill, who called her and asked her if she could give him a tour of the White House.
Yeah.
You want to tell that story?
Yeah, Missy was from a working class neighborhood of Boston called Somerville, and so was this young man, Thomas D. O'Neill. He had worked for FDR's campaign, and I'm not sure it was 32 or 36, but Missy said, if you ever find yourself in Washington, call me at the White House and I'll let you have a tour. So he was in Washington, he called her, she met him at the gate, took him in, and she said, how would you like to meet the president? And in his memoir, Man of the House, Tip O'Neill said that FDR was like God to him, and the idea that he would get to meet him, he was just almost, overcome. So she took him upstairs to the Oval Study. FDR had an Oval office, but he had an Oval Study too. And there was FDR in his wheelchair. And Tip O'Neill said that his mouth just dropped to his chest. He had no idea the president was paralyzed, and he thought he'd been let in on this huge state secret, and he never told anyone for years. But that was part of FDR's splendid deception, as the biographer Hugh Gallagher calls it, that people knew he had polio, they knew he had trouble walking, or that he had some, crippling aftermath, but they did not know he could not walk. So he worked out this fake walk where he would lock his braces, put a cane in his right hand, and then hold on to a strong man's arm in the other, sometimes leaving bruises on that person's arm, and then just kind of totter along using his big shoulders to, swing his body. And if a strong wind came along, if there was anything, he would just go crashing down. And there were a couple of times that happened, but the press never took pictures of it. And that's why this wheelchair footage is so rare. There are only a handful of known pictures of FDR in a wheelchair. Maybe one of him with the walk going on. So.
And it's amazing that, the relationship between Missy and the press, it sort of started, again, when she was in Albany.
Yeah.
And she had a very, I don't want to say cantankerous relationship with the press, but she kept them at a distance. She referred in her appointed book to the newsboys coming to town when the word got out FDR was going to run for president. I think the reporters liked Missy, and she was always willing to talk to them, but she was famous for being totally closed-mouthed, that she would talk and talk and talk, and then the reporter would get away and realize that she hadn't told him anything. And as a former reporter, I can tell you many times the same thing happened to me with a very sly politician, and he just talk and talk and talk and just charm me to death, and I'd get out and say, I can't write anything, he didn't tell me anything. So she learned from the master. FDR was famous for doing that too. So. Now, one of the other locations in the Roosevelt real estate empire, there was Springwood, and there was the homes in New York City, and there was Warm Springs. There was also Campobello up in New Brunswick in Maine, in Canada, on the border with Maine. And here's some footage here. What's really interesting about this is that after the famous 100 Days, FDR gets on a 42-foot sailboat with his son and a couple of his college friends, and they sail up the coast of New England, as the President of the United States. So you'll see the footage of them on the scroll if we can run this next clip. They were followed by a destroyer, but they were sailing. He loved to sail. FDR was quite a skilled helmsman.
Could have.
Yeah. He loved being on the water. They had some very rough seas and some difficult conditions. And a 42-foot boat is not a big boat. I love this conversation. I would love to know what they're saying.
That's Nancy Cook. That's Mary Dixon.
That's Mary Dixon. That's two of his sons there.
Eleanor's very serious.
Eleanor didn't like boats. She didn't go with him. She met him up there. And at one point, he took a shortcut through a very dangerous little inlet that he knew the destroyer couldn't follow. This is great. This is Eleanor christening this boat, or trying to.
Can't get the bottle.
Can't get the bottle to break.
She got wet.
That's a parade of boats when they went up there. So Campbell Island was sort of one of their retreats. This was actually the first time FDR had gone back to Campbell. That's where he came down with polio in 1921. So it had been 12 years since he had been back, and this had been the family's summer retreat. He'd been there every summer for 30-some years from the time he was a very small child. So this was a really triumphant return to him. He left, literally was carried out of the house on a stretcher when he came down with polio and returned 12 years later as president. So let's shift to the White House again now. The living arrangement was somewhat unusual. You want to describe that?
You know, it was unusual for today, but the Roosevelts just always had a lot of people living with them. So since Missy had been living in Albany in the governor's mansion for 4 years, she came to live in the White House too. She lived on the 3rd floor in a suite of rooms, a sitting room, a bedroom, and a bath. And Louis Howe came to live in the White House, and then Eleanor invited her friend Lorena Hickok to live in the White House, and some of the Roosevelt children and grandchildren came to live in the White House. And then a few years later, Harry Hopkins, another presidential advisor, came to dinner and didn't feel well, and he spent the night and stayed for 3 years. So Missy said that he was the inspiration for the play The Man Who Came to Dinner. So it wasn't. With the Roosevelts, they just had a lot of people around them all the time. And for Missy, it meant again that she was working 24/7 for the Roosevelts and serving as Eleanor's backup first lady, or backup hostess, not first lady, but hostess. So she would come down to the West Wing in the morning and work in the office outside the Oval. And then at the end of the workday, they would have a cocktail party for the inner staff called the Children's Hour, and FDR loved his cocktail party. And he would make martinis and all that, and they would go through the funny things in the mail or trade gossip or, talk about some of the things that they needed to iron out with the office. But mostly it was just cutting up. Missy's got these two wonderful charm bracelets. Where's Jane and Barbara? Raise your hands. These are the great nieces, Barbara Jakes and Jane.
You guys stand up.
Yeah, y'all stand up. These ladies have been such a treat to work with. They've adopted me as a cousin. They've adopted Paul also. Yeah. But they have these beautiful gold charm bracelets that Missy owned, and there are little charms all over them that gave me hints about what was important to her. She's got a little gold cocktail shaker and a little gold knife that's engraved, "Let's cut up." So I love these bracelets. So you need to look at them after this is over. But that was a daily thing, and then. They would just say family dinner, so that meant the Roosevelts and anyone else who happened to be in the White House. So usually Missy was eating in the White House. The head of the White House housekeeping was this woman named Henrietta Nesbitt, who was notorious for her terrible menus. She had been in Hyde Park. She was a neighbor of the Roosevelts, and she was struggling through the Depression by cooking pies and bread out of her kitchen, and for some reason Eleanor thought it would be a good idea to hire her to supervise the 60-person staff at the White House and oversee cooking food for hundreds of people a day. And she also was trying to stay within a budget and it was a Depression, and she told Mrs. Nesbitt that FDR liked plain food, plainly prepared, which wasn't true. He was a gourmet, but they just you read the menus and you're just going, green peas with every meal, a lot of tuna salad. So they would have these dinners that Mrs. Nesbitt had picked the menus for. There were a lot of social events in the White House. Missy got invitations to everything. When I went to Jane's house and she had laid all the invitations out, they covered her entire dining table in stacks of like 20 and 30. Every event with Ms. Lehan, please come to this or that. So even though she lived in the White House, she got an engraved invitation that she had to, accept the invitation and all that. And so she was just going all the time, and if there wasn't anything especially going on the social calendar, A lot of times she would just go sit with FDR in his Oval Study and they'd work with his stamps or talk about this or that or listen to music. And I think this is where her influence with him was really exercised, because she often said that she would just listen during the day to see what happened and then talk it over with FDR when they were alone in the evening. So that's...
Now, Missy had several suitors, one of whom was quite famous, Mr. Bullitt. You want to talk about that?
That was another thing that was a real surprise in the research for this book. I knew that she had had a relationship with this man, William Christian Bullitt, who was an ambassador. But what I didn't know is that it had lasted almost the entire time she was in the White House. He was the first ambassador to the Soviet Union. We had broken off relations after they had the revolution and killed the Tsar and his family and all that. And Bullitt was very interested in the Russians. He had sort of a romantic idea about communism. At that time, a lot of people did. And he was appointed the first ambassador to the Soviet Union. He and Missy had met when FDR ran in 1932, and by the end of 1933, they were becoming quite an item. And then he was there for 4 years, I think. Then he was sent to France. And he would come home for real long trips to visit, and he and Missy would go out, and he'd buy her flowers and jewelry, and they had a correspondence, and they'd talk on the phone. But it was a long-distance romance for the most part. But her letters are really very lovelorn. And unfortunately, Bill Bullitt was a real operator, and he was, in some ways, he was probably using her for access. He had a lot of other relationships on the side. One time she wrote and said, "I hear that you're engaged. Do I need to start saving my money to buy a station wagon for me?" That, to me, the idea that she was also the president's in-house mistress while having this really intense relationship, that didn't make any sense to me. She really loved this guy.
Yeah.
So.
And at this point, certainly by the second term, the Washington power structure, particularly the press, were aware that she was a player.
Yeah.
What did the Saturday Evening Post have to say about her?
Well, let me set the context. Louis Howe had died. And Missy was so ready for this guy to die. Because I know that's awful, but she said, he's had a fair share of life. Pretty much, why didn't he go and die already? Because in 1935, he was living in an oxygen tent in the White House. He had just smoked his lungs to death. And then he went into a coma, and everybody thought he was going to die. And then he came out of the coma and says, "Somebody give me a cigarette." And then by 1936, he was really done for, and they sent him off to the Naval Hospital to gasp his last breath. And even there, he demanded a telephone, and he was calling up cabinet officers and telling them to do things that countermanded what the president said. So he was just a real troublemaker at that point. But once Louis got out of the picture, a lot of his duties shifted to Missy, and she really started becoming pretty much the de facto chief of staff in the White House. All the players in the White House were called secretaries. There was no other ultimate title. So there was a press secretary, an appointed secretary. Missy was everything else. And then Roosevelt brought his son James in to be his liaison with all the alphabet agencies that had come about the New Deal. So a story came out in the Saturday Evening Post in 1930.
38,
yeah, called Missy to Do This, and it was written by Doris Gleason, who was a very respected woman journalist, and she just talked about how important Missy was in the White House. And the Missy to Do This was a little handwritten note that FDR had given her, and probably she got dozens of those every day. See to this, Missy, tell them no, Missy, I want to do this, Missy, where is $1 million for wildlife, that kind of thing. And she collected these little things called chits. So that article really put her out there as a powerful person who knew what was going on.
And the headline was Missy Knows.
Missy Knows, yeah.
But at the same time, there was an extraordinary layer of sexism in Washington and in the power structure. Obviously, the war that was to come changed some of that dynamic. But even in the late 30s, even when she really was acting as chief of staff,
she was paid half what the men were paid.
Right.
Now, she was paid very well for the time, but ultimately about $5,000 a year, which was a very good salary during the Depression. And she got room and board, but she was Louis Howe got room and board too, and he was paid twice what she was. So.
And there's also, I think, an element that she wasn't respected as a political leader the way she would have been if she'd been a man with that similar sort of accent.
Well, the whole thing that people wondered, well, maybe she's the president's girlfriend. Right. You never thought that about Louis Howe.
All right, so we're going to change up the tone a little bit here. We're going to go to a clip from Valkill, which shows somewhat the lighter side, because there really was an extraordinary sort of sense of humor and a joie de vivre that they had. This is from a picnic. Go ahead and roll it. A picnic they had in Valkill, originally for the press, and you'll see they had a series of competitions. And this is the egg chase. That's Eleanor. You see her?
There she is. She dropped her egg. There she goes.
There she goes right there.
Yeah.
With the little head, the hairband. And you can tell she's just laughing her.
She's very competitive. Look at that lady go. What is she want to try?
This poor guy keeps dropping it.
They're doing this with ties on. That's the part you like.
And now, there's something ironic about a three-legged race and the home of a paralyzed man.
I see Missy in the back. Yeah, look at this.
So they had a lot of fun.
Yeah, they did.
And one of the things that struck me as we were watching the footage, and again, it's thanks to Marvin and Jane, who, as the Rennies, they inherited this trunk and furniture and books and all these things from Missy that have sort of been hidden for 75 years. So it's fantastic that they were able to work with Kathryn and help us get access to these letters and this home movies. But one of the things you noticed a lot was that there was footage of Eleanor and her friends Marin and Nancy Cook, and you see that it really is like Missy's a member of the family.
Mm-hmm.
Now, and the children, treated her like the aunt.
Well, also, she handled FDR's checkbook, so they had to get their allowance from Missy. Now, even the adult children, the oldest two, who had really good jobs that they no doubt got because they were the president's children, were always writing, "Here's my check, I really need it badly." And she gave Eleanor her allowance, too. So.
I find that quite extraordinary that she gave Eleanor her allowance. So in 1939, Germany invades Poland, and the whole world dynamic starts changing. And there's, of course, quite a bit of discussion about whether or not Franco's going to run for an unprecedented third term. And, of course, Missy feels very strongly about this. And
I'd like to jump in, though, about the invasion of Poland. The rule at the White House was, and Missy was over the switchboard operators, is after the president had gone to bed at night, nobody could wake him up without her permission. So, on the night of September 1st, 1939, early in the morning, I always talk about the 2 a.m. phone call at the White House. This was the 2 a.m. phone call. It was by her bed. It was William Bullitt, her boyfriend, calling from Paris, and he'd gotten the word from the ambassador, the American ambassador to Poland, that Hitler had invaded Poland and, destroyed their army and air force. And so he wanted to talk to FDR, and she said, yes, of course, switch it through. So she got dressed and ran downstairs to his bedroom, and then the two of them sat up over that horrible news. And the quote from FDR was, "So Bill, it's come at last, God help us all." But he wrote out a little note on a little chit of paper, in bed, 3 or 4 a.m., the president was talking about himself in the third person and what his actions were. And he gave Missy the chit, and she put it in her scrapbook. Think about that. So they stayed up all night together, taking the action that needed to be taken. So, but that really changed everything. Of course, there'd never been a president who ran for a third term before. And the beginning of 1940, for FDR's birthday on January 30th, she wrote a funny little poem about who she should see about renewing her rent, because there was a lot of conjecture about who would run for office on the Democratic Party, and FDR would not say his plans. And Missy actually gave an interview where the reporter quoted her as saying that she hoped he would run again because she liked her $5,000 a year job in her apartment at the White House. which she said was, it twisted her words, it wasn't true at all. There were a couple of things, though, that I think made Missy really hesitant about FDR running again. One was that she had an awareness that his health was in decline. He was having dinner in February 1940 just with her and Bill Bullitt, and he fainted at the dinner table. And the doctor at the White House said that it was a very mild heart attack, but that was never released to anybody. No one ever knew about it for many, many years, but Missy knew. And there were just a lot of indications that FDR's health was on the decline. And I think it probably it was evident that her health was on the decline too. When you have rheumatic heart fever as a child, like you do, like she did, over time, your heart valve gets narrower and narrower, and finally, you're very short of breath. She was also smoking 2 or 3 packs of cigarettes a day, Lucky Strikes. So I think that she was really tired also. And when 1940, the Democratic Convention came along and FDR indicated he was willing to be nominated, there was a sort of a ruckus about his choice for Vice President Henry Wallace, and he let the word know out that unless Wallace was nominated, he would not accept the nomination. And he was actually drafted a speech to that effect. And Missy said, "Fine, I'm glad." And then when Wallace was nominated as he wished, she was the only one in the room who was in tears. And I think it's because she knew what this toll was taking on him. So he did get reelected, and she told a journalist that if he could stand another 4 years, she guessed she could too, which was a very ironic thing to say, considering what happened.
So just 6 months after the election, Missy suffers a stroke.
Yeah. It was in June 1941. There had been another spring where FDR had just had one health problem after another. He had been in bed for weeks at a time, and Missy and Harry Hopkins, the guy who lived in the White House, were just at his bedside all the time, just exhausted. And he had finally gotten better. He recovered, and they were having a party at the White House. It was the manager of the Willard Hotel gave a party for the White House staff every year. And they were, after dinner, Missy mentioned to Grace Tully, her assistant, that she didn't feel well, and then she screamed and fainted. And they took her upstairs to a room, and Dr. McIntyre thought it was overwork. They actually had to resuscitate her. But over time, what she was suffering from was this heart condition. And they finally just had to take her to a private hospital in Washington, and there she suffered a massive stroke from which she really never recovered. And
she did go down to Warm Springs for a while and to try to recover there.
Yeah, but she was partly paralyzed. She had aphasia. She didn't speak very well. And then she went back to the White House for a few months the next spring. But it was just a miserable situation because she was just in her room. She couldn't do anything. She couldn't help. She was just on the very edge of the life that she'd been in the middle of. And one day when she was apparently smoking in bed, she set her bedclothes on fire. And that was pretty much it. As soon as she had gotten healed up from the burns, and they were substantial, she was sent home to Somerville, and that's where she lived for the rest of her life with her family.
In our exhibit that's over in the library now about Pearl Harbor, which was December 1941, there's a little part about Missy calling in. So she's gone from being one of the most powerful women in the world to being essentially an invalid. And I think it was extremely difficult, as it is for so many people who leave the spotlight. You want to talk about that call and Grace?
Yeah, she called, and I don't know if she had a nurse with her. Maybe the nurse made the call because her speech was so bad, but she wanted to talk to FDR. Of course, the White House was a madhouse that day. And Grace took the message and told her that if he couldn't call that night, he'd call in the morning. And he didn't call that night. There's no indication he called the next morning either. But she took the news very, very hard, and she was in a very isolated town in the winter. Nobody was in Warm Springs during the winter, and got very depressed. And that was when they brought her back to the White House, but that wasn't the solution either. So she went home to her family.
Yeah. So the final years, she survived a couple years in Somerville. She got a little bit better, and there was certainly sort of a perception that FDR had dropped her like a hotcake. Now, man, he's fighting a global war and suffering with his own extreme health conditions. But thanks to Jane Barber, again, we discovered that, in fact, he had not abandoned her.
No, not at all. He never saw her again after that. And that's kind of difficult to take. But FDR was very famous for compartmentalizing people. And I think that's what he just finally had to do. I think we've all had a close friend or family member who suffers a catastrophic illness like a stroke and are so changed. And it's very difficult to accept that. And I would conjecture that that was the case with him. But he wrote her, he called her, he sent just wonderful gifts. Barbara has this gorgeous silver loving cup he sent for her birthday one year, engraved real elaborately, and it said, "This is truly a loving cup. Have a drink on me," and then fill it with flowers. Eleanor came to see her. A lot of the White House folks did, and a lot of the cabinet officers. Bill Bullitt came to see her and sent gifts and invited her to come to Washington. He wanted to give a birthday party for her. But I think she was real self-conscious about her appearance and her abilities at this point. And, but she would, she'd keep in touch. She was always following politics. She was trying to guess who FDR was going to choose for his running mate in 1944. And then she died of another stroke on July 31st, 1944.
Before she died, though, FDR wrote to her brother. And when we were looking through the correspondence, this was the letter that really jumped out at me, because it was filled with such anguish. Explain what the letter was about.
He had to tell her brother Dan, who was the oldest sibling in the family, that he was going to have to take her off the payroll because she hadn't been working for a year and a half. And he said, "I hate this so much." But he continued to pay all her medical expenses, all her rehab. He would do sweet things like send movie passes to her and send a car to pick her up and take her to movies. So, and ironically, the night that she died, she and some friends had gone to the movies, and she saw a newsreel of FDR. And it had been a while since she had seen one, and he looked dreadful. He was suffering from heart disease then, probably cancer also, just had wasted away to about, lost 40 pounds. And she was so upset, she asked to go home. And she was looking through some of the old pictures and memorabilia she had when she had the stroke. And she went to the Chelsea Naval Hospital and never regained consciousness. So they had a big funeral for her in Massachusetts. Eleanor Roosevelt came. Felix Frankfurter, who had been her friend, a Supreme Court Justice. Joseph P. Kennedy, who she was good friends with, came. FDR was on the other side of the country. He was in Alaska actually doing naval inspection, so he couldn't come, but he paid for the funeral. And the words that he said are engraved on her marker. It says she was utterly selfless in her devotion to duty, which was certainly true. And to this day, the Roosevelts pay for the upkeep of the grave of Missy Lehand and her niece and her niece's husband, the Lehand plot at Mount Auburn Cemetery.
FDR did something else, too, when he was concerned about her well-being.
He put her in his will, and he stipulated, this was for, I think it was about the same time he wrote the letter to Dan, that he wanted half the income of his estate to go to Eleanor and half to my friend Marguerite Hand, her medical needs. And he wanted to be sure if he died first, and he had to know that his health was pretty awful by then, that she wouldn't be abandoned. He wanted her to be taken care of. And he told his son James, "I owed her that much. She worked for me for so well for so long and asked for so little in return." And he said this to James on his inaugural day in 1944. By that time, Missy was dead, but he wouldn't change the will to reflect him.
So we're going to have one last clip, and then we're going to take questions from the audience. This is another clip from Springwood.
Okay.
So this is the train coming up HYDE Park Station.
Like those hats.
That's Sarah right there. And this is the famous, this is the first time we've seen film. This is the statue we have right out here. It's based on this. It's a famous photograph of this.
That was such a shock when I first saw that video. I've seen that scene. But the funny thing is, you see them sitting there, and then when you just got all these people standing around, it's like a press conference or something. It's not.
Well, many of us at the library have never seen this footage before, so.
Oh, the dog. This isn't Paula, I don't think, but this is another Scotty they have.
First Scotty.
Nick.
So, first of all, thank you, Kathryn. We have a microphone. I think we'll have a microphone. If you have any questions, I'm sure there's some questions out there with a lot of information in there.
Given what takes place in politics today, do you have any conjecture on exactly what Missy might have had in terms of policy issues with her private discussions with FDR?
No, that's a really good question, and I can't give you a single instance where I said, oh yeah, Missy came up with that idea. They had all kinds of... Well, they're people, but not, policy. She recommended, this is a good story about the Attorney General. The time that FDR took office, there was an interim between election in November until March the next year. It was the last time that happened. By the time he took office, he'd been the object of an assassination attempt. Almost every bank in the country was about to go under. Unemployment was 25%. So he put together this cabinet, and his Attorney General died on the way to the inauguration. He was a man. Yeah, he was a man in his 70s. He married a much younger woman from Cuba right before, and they were coming back from their honeymoon. And well, I don't know, but apparently it was presumption beyond disability. But and no one had any idea about who to replace him with. And the Attorney General was really important because they needed his to weigh in on some regulations. The laws we were going to try to use to close the banks down temporarily to reorganize them. Well, Missy finally popped up and said, well, what about Homer Cummings? He was a very well-known attorney from Connecticut. He had been the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, and nobody could think of a better choice. Well, Homer Cummings was supposed to be Governor General of the Philippines, and when the idea was sent to him, he said, Philippines or Attorney General? I think I'll take Attorney General. And he served as FDR's Attorney General for the next 6 years. So things like that. As I was saying, there was no shortage of people with ideas, and the New Deal just attracted all kinds of New Dealers, as they were called. But you still needed people in the room who knew how to get things moving, who could facilitate, and that's where Missy's genius really came in. FDR was a famous procrastinator, and Paul has said she and FDR dreamed up the idea of this library in their discussions in the evenings. What are we going to do with all this stuff, all these papers, all these prints you collect? And they thought of this idea for a library. But Paul says it never would have gotten built if it hadn't been Missy pushing FDR along, saying, you got to do this. She wouldn't let him go to bed until he finished writing speeches he had to do. But another really important introduction she made was to him was a man named Tommy Corcoran. And he was an Irish Catholic like her. He was a lawyer who worked in the federal government. He worked for something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And he was a protege of Felix Frankfurter, who was his professor at Harvard Law. There were a whole bunch of these proteges around the Capitol, and they were known as the Happy Hot Dogs. So, Frankfurter's Happy Hot Dogs. So he was one of the Happy Hot Dogs, and Frankfurter sent Missy a letter and said, I want to introduce you to my friend Tommy Corcoran. I have utmost confidence in him. I think he can do the president a lot of good. So one night, Missy asked Tommy to come over after dinner and play his accordion for the president, because FDR loved these sing around the piano evenings. He had a nice voice. Tommy had a nice voice. He enjoyed it. So Tommy started showing up at Missy's office every morning, and he'd say, okay, this is what the lowdown is. I heard this. I went to a cocktail party last night. Blah, blah, this is going to happen. So she would go into FD's office and say, FD, Tommy's out here, and he says blah, 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 blah. And FD would say, oh, send Tommy in. I want to hear about that. So in that way, he got really close to FDR, became his lobbyist on Capitol Hill. Never happened before. White House had never had a lobbyist. And he also drafted a lot of the New Deal legislation. One of the pieces that he worked on lobbying was the Social Security Act. And he also became sort of the fixer for the Roosevelt children with all their legal problems and romantic entanglements, 5 children, 19 marriages. So he was a very important figure in that administration. Does that answer your question?
I would say her biggest influence was in personnel. Who she recommended for, there are so many jobs to fill, and who she recommended to fill those jobs reflected the people whose ideas she agreed with. But that was an amazingly powerful position when you're spotting people in these positions.
Given your research, with her being, quote, segregated, but not really, why do you think the book hasn't been written prior to yours?
I will. He asked why a book has not been written before, and that's a really good question. I was shocked that there had not been one written before. I think part of it was that she left so few papers. A lot of her, the way she left the White House, she just kind of left everything behind. Her stuff went on the attic eventually, and then when FDR died so suddenly, everything was just kind of packed all up and sent home. Grace Tully, who was her assistant, who succeeded her as secretary, took a lot of documents out of the White House herself, including Missy's papers that she shouldn't have, would you say? And it took a long, long time, decades. When did y'all get them back?
Well, they were bought, I think 2010 or
Okay, it took that long. So that was the first big trove of Missy's papers that showed up. And then when I started reading through those, I did some research in Warm Springs. I found her medical file down there and realized that the times when she had been described as having nervous breakdowns over the years were actually medical episodes with her heart. And thanks to the archivist at Warm Springs, I was put in touch with Jane and Barbara, and they just had the mother load. So it was papers that were in a lot of different places. And I also went through, I've read 100 books. A lot of them were books that were written back in the 30s that no one has really read in a long time. Everyone who had any relationship with FDR talked about Missy. One of the best books is almost never mentioned anymore. It's Fulton Ouchler, who was editor of Liberty Magazine. It was the largest circulation magazine in the country. And he and Missy got to be very good friends. So he wrote a lot about Missy and her power in the White House and what she was like personally. So it's really just digging all this stuff out from all these different places. But it wasn't like she kept a diary and every night, she wrote, FD said this, and then I said, FD, why don't you appoint, She never kept a diary, and she was very proud of the fact that she never kept a diary.
We had a question over here.
I wonder what her relationship was with Daisy, FDR's distant cousin, who spent a lot of time at the White House.
It's kind of a tenuous relationship. I think that they knew each other. They probably liked each other. There's kind of an interesting thing. When Daisy was going to have surgery to have a tumor removed, not sure what year it was, 37 or 38, she had all these letters from FDR and these diaries in a suitcase under her bed, and she left these detailed instructions with her brother that if she didn't survive the surgery, to wrap it all up and take it to the White House and give it to no one but Miss Lehand. So Missy was the one who handled all the correspondence between Daisy and FDR, so perfectly aware of that very close and important friendship. But there are a couple of mentions of her in the Daisy letters and diaries, not a lot.
You have another question out here? Raise your hand. We'll bring the microphone over to you. Over here.
How did you start on this project? Are you a journalist?
Yes. I was a newspaper journalist, and this might be a good time to talk about my grandfather, my pawpaw. Pawpaw was a newspaper printer, and in the Depression years, when he was a young father, he and my grandmother really struggled. They lived in Georgia. He always had a job, but his paychecks bounced a lot, and a lot of the newspapers he worked closed, and he would just be left flat. And even as a very small child, he just taught me to revere FDR, because it was when FDR came in with the New Deal that their lives started getting better. So, and he was a yellow dog Democrat. He would vote for a yellow dog if it was on the Democratic ticket. I used to ask him, Papa, why do you always vote Democratic? And he said, well, it's the Democrats that just always had the best candidates. So that was before Georgia became a red state. So that was, I guess, just that lifelong interest. And I think I did my first term paper in high school on FDR. So the journalistic background, I've been a newspaper reporter and editor for 17 years, and then I left the profession and worked in nonprofits for about another 17 years. And I just decided, well, it's time to go back and start writing again. And this project, just I got so intrigued. I think that Barbara and Jane and I were all kind of galvanized by that horrible movie, HYDE Park on the Hudson. Let's have it up here at HYDE Park. A horrible, horrible movie that made Daisy and Missy just look like floozies, and Sarah looked like a madam. It was horrible. And I thought, that is so unfair. And it's so unfair that Hollywood can take a good person like Daisy or Missy and make her look like this. So this is my answer.
Do some book signings if there's no more questions.
There's a lady right here.
When you were talking about Louis Howe and you mentioned the man who came to dinner, I was actually thinking of FDR as the Sheridan Whiteside person in a way, because if you remember, that character was trying to undermine Betty Davis having a life. And I wondered if anybody ever said, hey, how about letting her not work 24 hours a day for you, so that she could actually have a social life outside of the White House?
That's a really good question. Well, I think she did have one, and most of what's been written before made it sound like just this real drudge that never did anything but work and slave away for the Roosevelts. But I think it was I made it pretty clear in my book that she did have a very lively social life. She had friends outside the White House. She had William Christian Bullitt. But I think she loved her work. She loved the Roosevelt. She loved her work. Good heavens, it had to be the most exciting job on earth. And she wasn't alone in that. FDR was just so tremendously charismatic that many people just laid their lives down for him. Marvin Mcintyre, the appointment secretary, died of tuberculosis in the White House. Very few people lived long lives who were around the Roosevelts. There was a maid in the White House who said that the White House just wore people out like soap. And it really did. Yeah. So, a lot of them died really young. Missy was just 47.
Any last questions?
Do you have plans to write another book?
I do, I've got a few more ideas, but I think what I really want to do is rescue women from obscurity who need to be known. That I'll ever write a book about a person that I come to care about as deeply is Missy. I hope that when I get to my regular ward, I'll run into her and she'll say, you did a pretty good job.
Well, on that note, I think
Are there one or two things that you'd really like to know about Missy Lehand that you weren't able to get to the bottom of through your research?
Well, there are a few charms on those bracelets. I'd really like to know what they did. One is a mouse trap that on the bottom is engraved 4:40 a.m. Yeah, there would be a lot of she's got a lot of secrets, and I may have gotten things totally wrong, but that's what history's for. It's a moving river, and someday, maybe this book will prompt somebody to say, I've got a bunch of letters that Missy wrote my grandmother, and they'll open some new key. So I hope that the story continues. I hope this will not be the last biography about her.